Okay, so today we're really getting into something that's kind of all around us, all the time, but we don't always think about it too much. It's this idea of culture and especially how it plays out in societies where you've got tons of different people, backgrounds, all that. You guys send in a ton of great stuff on this, and we're going to try to unpack it all.
Yeah, it's one of those things, culture. Like, we all use the word, we kind of know what it means generally, but when you really try to define it, it gets, well, really tricky.
Yeah.
This Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy even says that right up front. Like, they call culture super broad. Like, it can be a whole nation, or it could be like my little D&D group.
Okay.
And also, the encyclopedia says it's really ambiguous.
Right, because you can be part of so many, like, at the same time, like, I'm American, I'm also, a podcast host. So many different things.
Exactly.
But here's the thing, though. Even if it's hard to say, like, exactly what culture is, pretty much everyone agrees it matters. Big time. It gives us that sense of belonging, like we're part of something. It helps us understand each other, even if we're different. And it gives us values, like those really important things that tell us what's good, what's right. And all this is why this deep dive is so important. Because understanding culture, well, it helps us figure out how to live together, especially when we're thinking about laws, politics, all that.
Totally. And the encyclopedia actually breaks it down into four main ways philosophers have looked at culture.
Okay, so four lenses to help us see this thing, this culture thing. I like
Oh,
that.
yeah. So we've got culture as like a big group that kind of surrounds you. Then there's culture as like how you're shaped by society. Then there's culture as like stories and conversations back and forth. And then finally, culture as your own identity, who you feel you are.
Okay, so four different ways to look at the same thing. Gotcha.
Yeah. And as we go through these, we got to keep in mind this thing called the essentialist critique. It's basically saying be careful about assuming that everyone in a culture is like exactly the same, shares all the same beliefs and all that. Some older ideas about culture, they kind of fell into that trap. But the stuff we'll be looking at today tries to get past that, to be a bit more nuanced.
Yeah, makes sense. So our deep dive mission today is first, we got to get a handle on these four different ways of seeing culture.
Yeah.
Then we got to see how these ideas play out in the real world, like how do different groups, minority groups, majority groups, use these ideas when they're arguing for things from the government. Think about it like we're becoming philosophy detectives, using these ideas to make sense of the culture clues all around us.
I like that, philosophy detectives.
Right. Let's start with the first one. Culture as this big, all-encompassing group, the kind that shapes pretty much everything you do.
Right. So this perspective is all about how deeply culture can get into like all parts of your life, big choices, little choices, even how you feel about things. It's everywhere.
Like, how do I know if something's good or bad, right from wrong?
Yeah.
Is it because of my culture? That kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And a philosopher named Will Kymlicka, he came up with this idea of societal culture, which is like, it's the context for like almost all your choices. And he's talking about everything, social stuff, education, religion, free time, even money stuff.
Like, if I decide to go to college, is that because my culture values education? Or if I decide to spend my Saturday watching football, is that because of my culture?
It could be. And Kymlicka says this happens in public and in private. It's kind of the invisible rules of the game of life, Like, think about whole countries. Often a whole country has one main societal culture. And it's the same with lots of indigenous groups, Native American tribes here, Aboriginal folks in Australia. They've got their own distinct ways of life, their own institutions, and that shapes their culture. Then there are groups within a bigger country who have their own strong culture, like the Catalans in Spain, the Tibetans in China. But Kaneka points out, like, immigrant groups, when they come to a new country, they usually end up part of that bigger culture that's already there, even if they keep their own traditions too.
So it's like there's this dominant culture that's kind of the backdrop, even if people within it have their own smaller cultures too.
Exactly. It's complex, right? Another philosopher, Michael Walzer, he talks about political communities as communities of character. So it's like we're all bound together by this like shared world of meaning. And often we don't even realize it's there.
It's like the air we breathe. We just take it for granted.
Totally. Then you've got Avishai Margalit and Joseph Raz. They talk about these encompassing groups, giving people like a deep sense of who they are, like, this is where I belong. And it's like a safe space, too, where you don't have to constantly explain yourself. You just like fit in.
Makes sense. So our culture shapes how we see ourselves, where we belong, even what we like and don't like, what opportunities we have.
And Margalit and another guy, Moshe Halbertal, they use ultra-Orthodox Jewish culture as a really good example. Because it's not just about religion, right? It's about everything. It's what you do all day. Maybe you study the Torah. It's what jobs you can have. It's even who you marry.
Wow, so it's like all-encompassing, like the name of this first way of seeing culture.
Totally. Food, architecture, language, art, music, clothing, all of it's influenced by their culture.
So it's not just about beliefs, it's about how you actually live your life.
Yeah, and what's interesting is each of these philosophers, they focus on slightly different things. Kymlicka is big on the freedom that a strong culture gives you, all the meaningful choices you can make because you have that foundation. Then you've got Margalit and Halbertal. They're all about how culture shapes your core identity, who you are deep down. And Walser, he's talking about the shared consciousness that comes from a culture, the sense of we that it creates. But they all agree on this basic idea. Culture is like the value system, the framework that helps you understand and navigate your choices.
Makes sense. And Walter has this great example. He's talking about bread.
Bread.
Yeah, bread. He says, in some cultures, it's just food, right?
Hmm.
But in other cultures, bread is like this deeply symbolic thing. It's about sharing, community, even religious ideas.
Yeah,
So even something as simple as bread can mean totally different things depending on your culture.
I've never thought about it that way.
And that helps us see why messing with a culture, like trying to erase it or force it to change, can be so damaging. It's not just about losing some traditions. It's about destroying the way people understand the world, the way they make sense of their choices. Think about, like, what colonizers did to indigenous cultures. It wasn't just about land. It was about attacking their whole way of life, their values, their understanding of who they are.
Right. But there are some problems with this whole idea of culture as this all-encompassing thing, this encompassing group, and that's where that essentialist critique comes in.
Right. The thing about assuming everyone in a culture is like a clone of everyone else.
Exactly. The critics are like, hold on. This view can assume everyone in a culture follows all the same practices, all the same values at the same level of importance. And in reality, it's just not that simple. Cultures are way more diverse internally, of debates, disagreements, different ways of seeing things.
So it's like saying Italian culture is this or Chinese culture is that is way too simplistic.
Right. You're painting with too broad a brush. The essentialist critique has a few main points. One is, it can make it seem like some parts of a culture are unchanging the core essence. And if
Yeah.
you change those, the whole culture falls apart. But cultures are living things. They change. People within a culture argue about what's really important.
It's not like a statue frozen in time. It's more like I don't know, a garden, always growing and changing.
Yeah, something like that. Another problem is, by picking out these supposed core parts of a culture, you end up excluding people. Like, someone might feel Italian, but maybe they don't care about, I don't know, opera. Does that mean they're not really Italian?
Right. It's like saying you're only a true American if you love baseball and apple pie. That excludes a lot of people.
Exactly. And the third problem is, this view ignores the fact that most of us belong to multiple cultures. Like,
Yeah.
I'm a philosopher, but I'm also a dad, a husband, whatever.
So many things.
Yeah.
And all those things influence how we see the world. It's not just one single culture that defines us.
Right. So that's the problem with culture as encompassing group. It can be too rigid, too focused on making everyone fit into the same box. Which brings us to the next way of seeing culture, culture as social formation. This one tries to fix those problems by looking at how shared experiences over time shape what a culture is.
So less about, like, rules and more about how you're molded by your experiences.
Yeah. Alan Patton, he's the one who really talks about this. He says, what makes a culture is not a list of beliefs, but the fact that people have gone through similar stuff that shaped their worldview. Like, they've been formed by similar experiences.
So give me some examples. What kind of experiences are we talking about?
Think about, schools. Everyone who went to school in America, they've all had a kind of similar experience, right? Different schools, but similar structures, similar ideas. Or the language. We're all surrounded by English in the media, in books. That shapes how we think.
So even if we have different opinions, we're all coming from that same starting point of, like, speaking English, going to school in the American system.
Exactly. Then there's history. The stories we're told about our past that shapes how we see the world. Family structures, too. In some cultures, big families are the norm. In others, it's more about smaller, nuclear families. All these things, they add up to a shared way of seeing things, a set of assumptions about how the world works.
So even if we don't agree on everything, there's this underlying shared understanding that comes from being shaped by similar institutions, similar experiences.
Right. And Patton says these institutions, they're often kind of separate from the ones that shape people outside the culture. So like the American school system, it's different from the school system in Japan or in France, and that helps create different cultures.
So it's like we're all kind of being molded by the same forces within our own cultures, and those forces are different from the ones shaping people in other cultures.
Exactly. And Patton makes a really important point. He says for this to work, for people to really be shaped by their culture in a good way, they need to have control over these institutions. Like if you don't have a say in what your kids are learning in school, if you don't have control over your media or the stories that are told about your history, then your culture is being shaped by someone else, not by you.
So it's like if a government comes in and says, you're not allowed to teach your language in schools anymore, that's not just about language. It's about taking away control over how your culture is shaped.
Exactly. And Patton says that's a huge injustice. So this view of culture as social formation, it avoids that essentialist problem because it's not about saying these are the unchanging rules of the culture. It's about shared experiences, shared shaping. So a culture can change, the actual practices and beliefs can evolve, but what holds it together is that underlying shared history of formation.
I see. So like American culture today is different from what it was 100 years ago, but there's still that shared history of like public schools, English language, all that.
Exactly. But even this view has some problems, some critics, like Anne Phillips, she says, hold on, who's in charge of these institutions, the ones doing the shaping? Because those people, they might not actually represent everyone in the culture.
Right. Like if it's a small group of elites who control the schools, the media, they might be shaping the culture in a way that benefits them, but not everyone else.
Exactly. So that brings us to our third way of understanding culture. Culture as dialogue. This one's all about the idea that cultures are created through conversations, arguments, disagreements, back and forth between people.
So it's not like someone's handing you a rule book. It's like we're all constantly talking about it, figuring it out together.
Exactly. Thinkers like James Tully and Salah Ben Habib, they're big on this. Tully said, cultures are always being contested, imagined, and reimagined, transformed, negotiated. It's all about this ongoing process.
So like even within American culture, we're always arguing about what it means to be American, right? What values are important? What traditions should we keep?
Exactly. And Ben Habib adds this idea of narratives, stories. She says we experience culture through shared stories, but these stories are always up for debate. They're contestable.
Okay, so it's not just about like facts. It's about how we interpret those facts, how we tell stories about ourselves.
Right. But here's the thing. If culture is always changing, always being debated, how do we even talk about protecting it? What are we trying to protect?
Good point. It's like if it's always in motion, how do you hold on to it?
The idea is you don't protect specific practices, like this dance must always be done this way. You protect the process, the conversation. You make sure there's space for people to argue, to disagree, to change things. You protect the ability of people to shape their own culture.
So it's not about freezing culture in time. It's about making sure it can keep evolving, keep adapting.
Exactly. And this idea of dialogue, it's really important when we think about power dynamics within cultures. Like Rita Damon, she says, we got to ask whose voices are being heard in these conversations. Because historically, it's often been the powerful people, the ones at the top, who get to define the culture. And that can be bad for people who are marginalized, like women or minority groups.
Which brings up this point that Susan Mahler-Auken made about how sometimes respecting culture can actually be bad for women.
Yeah.
Like, if the culture itself has oppressive practices.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. Like, how do you balance respecting a culture with protecting people within that culture?
Right. It's a real dilemma.
Well, the dialogue view says first you got to acknowledge the problem. Like, yes, some cultural practices are harmful, but then you also got to recognize that people within those cultures, they might be working to change things from the inside.
So, like, instead of saying this culture is bad, we need to get rid of it, you're saying let's support the people who are trying to make it better.
Exactly. Monique DeVoe's work shows this. She looked at women in South Africa who are in customary marriages. These marriages, they can be really unequal. The women don't have the same rights. But a lot of these women, they still value their culture, and they're working to change those marriage practices from within.
So it's not about just blindly accepting a culture as it is, warts and all. It's about supporting the people who are trying to make it more just, more equal.
Right. Patty Tamara Leonard says, it's about democratizing how cultural norms are made. It's got to be a process where everyone has a voice, everyone can participate.
So, like, a culture can change, but it should change because the people within it want it to change, not because someone from the outside is forcing them.
Exactly. But then Margaret Moore, she brings up a problem. She calls it the individuation challenge. It's like, if culture is all about this ongoing conversation, always changing, how do you even say who's part of a culture and who's not?
Right, because it's all blurry, right? It's not like you have a membership card.
Exactly. This matters for things like law and politics. Like, if we're going to give a group special rights because of their culture, we got to know who's in the group.
Makes sense. So how do we deal with that?
Well, Bena Habib, she helps explain this. She says people from the outside, they look at a culture and they're like, oh, that's a unified group. But people inside the culture, they experience it as all these different stories, different interpretations, sometimes conflicting.
So, like, outsiders see it as a solid block, but insiders see all the cracks, the variations.
Exactly. So it's hard to say you're in, you're out. People engage with their culture in different ways. Some people are super involved in every aspect. Some people are more on the fringes.
Makes sense. Okay, so that's the dialogue view. Culture is created through conversation, but that makes it hard to define exactly who belongs and who doesn't.
Mhm.
So what's the fourth and final way of seeing culture?
This one is called Culture as Identity. And this is all about how you see yourself, your own personal sense of belonging.
So less about rules or practices, more about how you feel.
Exactly. Margaret Moore, she uses Northern Ireland as an example. You've got the Catholics and the Protestants there, right? Deep divisions, lots of conflict. But when you actually look at their values, like what they think is important, there's a lot of overlap.
Really?
Yeah. So Moore says it's not that their cultures are so different, it's that they have these deeply entrenched identities. They see themselves as fundamentally different groups.
So it's like, even if they agree on a lot of things, their sense of who they are, their identity, is what divides them.
Exactly. And this view of culture, it helps explain why someone might feel really connected to a culture, even if they don't follow all the traditional practices. You know, like maybe your grandparents were immigrants and you don't speak their language, you don't eat their food, but you still feel a connection to that culture.
Like, it's part of your story, part of who you are, even if you don't live it every day.
Right. And this view also works for identities that aren't usually seen as cultural, like being LGBTQ plus B. Abigail Eisenberg and Cyril Gauche talk about this. They say, instead of trying to define exactly what makes something cultural, we can just focus on how people identify.
So it's more inclusive. It's not just about your ethnicity or your nationality. It's about any group that you feel a sense of belonging to, any aspect of your identity that's important to you.
Yeah, and Eisenberg says identity is this big umbrella term. It covers your religion, your language, your gender, if you're indigenous, all sorts of things. It's all about how you understand yourself and your place in the world.
Okay, so those are the four ways of understanding culture. That was a lot, but I think we covered it. Now, how do these ideas play out in real life? Like when groups are making demands on the government based on their culture, the encyclopedia talks about accommodation, which is a fancy word for all the different kinds of things groups might ask for.
Yeah, and the kinds of threats different groups face, they're not all the same, right? So the way the government responds, it's got to be different too.
Like an indigenous group trying to protect their land is different from, say, a group of immigrants asking for language rights.
Exactly. And there's a big debate about, like, are cultural rights individual rights or are they group rights? Like, is it about me having the right to practice my culture or is it about my group having the right to exist?
That's a good question.
Our approach here, we're going to say it can be both. Sometimes it's about the individual, sometimes it's about the group, sometimes it's both. But most people who study multiculturalism, they agree that these accommodation rights, they make the most sense when they're about helping minority groups integrate into society and fixing inequality.
Like giving everyone a fair shot, regardless of their background.
Exactly. But Sarah Song, she has this interesting point. She says a lot of what we call multicultural claims are actually about race, religion, ethnicity. And the things they're asking for, they're often just basic democratic rights, like freedom of religion or making up for past wrongs.
So maybe we can solve some of these problems without even talking about culture specifically.
That's what Song suggests. But as the encyclopedia points out, that can make it hard to deal with cases where culture is, like, tangled up with other issues. Like, think about the Swiss minaret ban.
Remind me what that was about.
So Switzerland, they banned building new minarets on mosques. Some people said that's fine, it doesn't violate religious freedom because Muslims don't need minarets to pray. But that totally ignores the cultural meaning. For many Muslims, minarets are super important, symbolically.
So even if it's not strictly about religion, it's still about something meaningful to that culture.
Exactly. Same with Muslim face coverings. Like some people say it's just a piece of cloth, you can still be Muslim without it. But for a lot of Muslim women, it's part of their understanding of their religion, part of their cultural identity.
Right. So we got to look beyond the surface, see the cultural significance behind these practices. Okay, so let's break down the different types of claims minority groups might make. First up, exemption rights.
These are basically when a group says, hey, this law, it's meant for everyone, but it unfairly hurts us because our culture, can we be exempt?
Like the Sikh turban and motorcycle helmets thing, right?
Exactly. Jacob Levy talks about this. He says it's about recognizing that different groups have different needs. And sometimes the law, even if it's well-intentioned, can create unfair burdens. Jonathan Kwong and Amy Gutman, they also talk about this, preventing unfair burdens.
Like indigenous groups asking to be exempt from certain hunting or fishing rules that would clash with their traditional practices. Or, back in the day, some religious groups were exempt from laws that said businesses had to be closed on Sundays.
Right. Without these exemptions, it's like you got to choose between being a good member of your culture and being treated equally by the law, and it's not a fair choice.
Right, because both are important. It's not about getting special treatment. It's about making sure everyone has an equal opportunity to participate in society.
Exactly. And it's important to separate exemption rights from what we call rule modifications. That's when a group says, can you change the rules a bit to make space for us?
So not just letting me opt out, but actually changing the system.
Yeah, like changing uniform rules so people can wear turbans or hijabs, or giving Muslim employees time for prayer during the workday, or making sure schools have kosher or halal food options.
So instead of saying, you're different, you do your thing over there, it's saying, let's make the system itself more inclusive.
Right. And if you don't do that, it can be really exclusionary. Like the Randers pork law in Denmark, where they made all public schools serve pork. That basically excluded Muslim and Jewish kids who don't eat pork.
Right. It's like saying, you're welcome here, but only if you conform to our way of doing things. And it's not just about immigrants either. Indigenous groups have been asking for these kinds of things for a long time. And so have a lot of religious groups like Orthodox Jews who have different needs when it comes to things like food, clothing, all that.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't always work in a diverse society. Okay, so that's exemptions and rule modifications. Next up, assistance rights.
Okay, so what's that about?
This is when groups ask the government to actually help them, like financially, to keep their culture alive. Like maybe they need money to support their language or their arts or their cultural institutions.
So, like, if the government funds the symphony orchestra, maybe a minority group could say, hey, we need funding for our traditional music, too.
Exactly. The idea is the dominant culture, it often gets a lot of support from the government, without even asking. So minority cultures, they're just asking for a fair share.
Right, it's about leveling the playing field. And how does this connect to our 4 ways of seeing culture?
This one usually fits with those ideas of culture as like a whole way of life, a social formation, something that needs to be protected and supported as a whole. So it's like the group itself needs help to survive.
Gotcha. So it's different from those exemption rights, which are more about individual freedom to practice your culture.
Exactly. Okay, now I've got the big one, self-determination rights.
This sounds serious.
It is. This is about groups saying, we want to control our own territory, our own institutions. Like imagine a group within a country saying, we want to be our own little state with our own laws, our own schools.
Wow, that's a big ask. Who makes these kinds of claims?
It's usually groups that have a strong sense of being different, like indigenous groups. They often want more control over their traditional lands and their own affairs. And then you've got groups like the Basques in Spain or the Scots in the UK who feel like they're a separate nation within a bigger country.
So they want to govern themselves, make their own decisions about things that are important to them.
Exactly. And this usually goes back to those ideas about culture as an encompassing group or as a social formation. Like, you need to have control over your own institutions to really be self-determining.
Makes sense. So what kind of things are they asking for control over?
Education is a big one. They want to teach their own language, their own history, their own values in their schools. Language policy in general is important, like what languages are official, what languages are used in government. And then there's things like how public spaces are organized, like what holidays are celebrated, what symbols are displayed.
So it's really about shaping their own society, their own environment, based on their own culture.
Exactly. And Margalit and Helberthal, they say there are three parts to this self-determination thing. First, the bigger state, the country, has to leave them alone. That's non-interference.
Hmm.
Second, the bigger state has to formally recognize them as a distinct group. That's recognition.
Okay, so not just leaving them alone, but actually saying, yes, we see you as a separate entity.
Exactly. And the third part is the bigger state might actually have to help them out, like with money or resources.
Hmm.
That's active backing.
So it goes from just leaving them alone all the way to actively supporting their self-determination.
Right. Okay. Next up, recognition rights.
What are those about?
This is about getting the government to formally acknowledge a group's identity, their status, their importance, and it's about being treated with respect as equals. Celine McBride talks about this.
So it's like not just tolerating them, but actually saying, we value your presence here. We recognize your contributions.
Exactly. Like the Quebecois in Canada, they fought hard to be recognized as a nation within Canada, not just a province. And a lot of Indigenous groups, they want the government to officially recognize them as the original inhabitants of the land or as distinct nations with their own rights. And sometimes this leads to things like land acknowledgements, where the government formally acknowledges the Indigenous history of a place.
Right, so it's symbolic, but it's also about acknowledging the historical wrongs that were done.
Exactly. And recognition can also be about language. Like in Switzerland, Romansh is an official language, even though very few people speak it. But in Turkey, the Kurdish language isn't recognized, even though millions of Kurds live there.
So recognizing a language is like saying, your culture is valued here. You have the right to express yourself in your own language.
Exactly. Okay, now we get to a tricky one. Cultural preservation rights.
This sounds pretty broad.
It is. It's basically about the right of a group to keep existing as a distinct group. Amy Gutman calls it the right to the survival of a culturally specific people.
So it's not just about individual rights, it's about the group itself having the right to continue.
Right. And there are a bunch of reasons people give for this, like protecting minority cultures from being absorbed by the dominant culture, or honoring old treaties that promised cultural autonomy to certain groups, or just recognizing that having lots of different cultures is good for society, like Bhikkhu Parekh says.
Okay, so lots of justifications, but I imagine this can get controversial, right?
Definitely, especially when you're talking about groups whose practices might clash with, like, liberal values. Like, what if a group wants to preserve practices that are harmful to women or children?
That's a tough one.
It is. The encyclopedia says there are two ways to think about what cultural preservation even means. Is it about keeping the group alive no matter what? Or is it about preserving specific practices and values? And then there are all these different ways it can play out, like exemptions from certain laws, letting parents control their kids' education, letting groups handle their own internal conflicts, even letting groups decide who can be a member.
So lots of variations. And how does this fit with our 4 ways of seeing culture?
This usually goes along with those ideas of culture as an encompassing group or as a social formation. Like the group itself needs to be protected for the culture to survive. And we see this with groups like the Amish, who want to be exempt from laws that require kids to stay in school past a certain age. Or some minority groups, they want to keep their own traditional legal systems, especially when it comes to family law.
But again, there's that tension with, like, what if the group's practices are harmful to some of its own members?
Yeah, that's a big issue. Eilert Shachar and Natasha Bakht have written about this, about how we need to make sure cultural preservation doesn't come at the cost of individual rights.
Right, so it's a balancing act. How do you respect a group's right to exist without ignoring the rights of the people within that group?
Exactly. And Monique DeVoe, she makes this point. She says, even in cultures that have oppressive elements, there are often people working to change things from the inside. Like, they love their culture, they want to preserve it, but they also want to make it better.
So it's not about outsiders coming in and saying, you need to change. It's about supporting the people who are already fighting for justice within their own communities.
Right. And a big part of this is the right to exit, which Chandran Kukathars talks about. Like, if someone doesn't like the way their culture is, they should have the right to leave. And Elizabeth Holzitz-Leichner says, the government has a role to play here, like making sure people who leave a group get the support they need.
Okay, so that's cultural preservation. Next up, rights against cultural loss. How is that different?
So preservation is about groups trying to actively maintain their culture. This one,